All right, welcome back, everyone. We're diving headfirst into the Israel-Hamas conflict today, specifically the hostage situation in Gaza. You've brought us some articles, and yeah, things are looking pretty intense. We want to help you get beyond those headlines and really understand what's going on.
Well, it's definitely a complex situation. Yeah, I mean, we had that ceasefire and there was some relief, but now it feels like things are kind of, teetering on the edge. You've got these clashes of priorities. Both sides are digging in.
And then you've got Trump, right, throwing a real curveball with his last warning to Hamas. Went on Truth Social, no less, and said, quote, "Release all of the hostages now, not later, or it is over year for you. Only sick and twisted people keep bodies, and you are sick and twisted." I mean, that's some pretty strong language. Do you think that's effective?
It's tough to say. This is Trump we're talking about. He's unpredictable. He likes to be blunt. Maybe he thinks he can shock Hamas into action. But yeah, it could backfire too, make him even more stubborn.
And they kind of did, right? Hamas basically said no. They're sticking to the original ceasefire terms. Phased release of hostages, permanent ceasefire, Israeli withdrawal from Gaza. It feels like they're playing a dangerous game here.
What you have to remember is that for Hamas, the hostages are their biggest bargaining chip. They're not going to just give that up, especially when they feel like they have the advantage. But we also have to think about what this means for the hostages themselves and their families.
Yeah, it's easy to get lost in the politics of it all. But there are 24 hostages still believed to be alive, including that Israeli-American Edan Alexander. The families must be going through absolute hell.
Absolutely. It's a horrible situation. And it really highlights the human cost of this whole conflict, the stuff that gets lost in the political speeches. And then you've got the issue of holding on to remains for prisoner exchanges, which both sides do. It just adds another layer of tragedy to an already awful situation.
It's hard to even wrap your head around it, honestly. Okay, so we've got Trump's ultimatum, Hamas refusing to back down, and the hostages caught in the middle, and then, bam, out of nowhere, we get this bombshell. The White House confirms they've been in direct talks with Hamas.
Yeah, that was huge. I mean, this goes against everything the U.S. has done for years. They've always refused to engage with Hamas because they consider them a terrorist organization. So what changed?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Is this about the hostages? Are they just trying to calm things down? Or is there some bigger strategy here that we're not seeing?
It's probably a mix of things, to be honest. The U.S. is a strong ally of Israel, but they also want stability in the region. By talking directly to Hamas, they're opening a line of communication that could, potentially lead to something positive.
But isn't that a massive risk? I mean, for years, the U.S. has been condemning Hamas as terrorists. Won't this damage their relationship with Israel?
It's a balancing act, for sure. They're trying to support Israel while also finding a solution that actually works. By talking to Hamas, they're admitting that the old way of isolating and demonizing them just hasn't worked. Maybe they're ready for a different approach. And who knows, maybe that could change things down the line.
Makes you think, for sure. It's a gamble, but if it gets the hostages back and stops more fighting, maybe it's worth it. But there's another player in all of this, and that's Egypt, right? They're stepping up with a $53 billion reconstruction plan for Gaza. I mean, where are they even getting that kind of money?
$53 billion, that's a lot of money. It came out of the Arab League summit. And the idea is to not just rebuild buildings, but also get the economy going again and fix social problems. It's a big plan.
Sounds like Egypt's trying to be the hero here, giving Gaza some hope for the future. But is this the right time? I mean, can you rebuild when things are so unstable? And can anyone trust Hamas to use the money wisely?
Those are all good questions. If this plan is going to work, there needs to be lasting peace, trust between everyone. And of course, the money actually has to materialize. It's not clear if the Arab nations are going to cough up that much, especially with their own economic problems.
So we've got Trump's ultimatum, the U.S. talking to Hamas, and Egypt coming in with this massive reconstruction plan. Things are changing fast. What does all of this mean for the hostages and for the future of Gaza?
It's tough to say. We're in uncharted territory. What's clear is that the stakes are incredibly high for everyone involved.
Let's take a quick break here to gather our thoughts. When we come back, we'll dig into those conflicting ceasefire plans and what they might mean for the future of Gaza. Stick with us.
We should take a closer look at these ceasefire plans because that's where a lot of the tension is. The original one from January, the one Egypt put together, it had a very specific framework.
Right, I remember that. It was all about those phased releases. Hostages go free, Palestinian prisoners get released, then there's a permanent ceasefire, and Israel pulls out of Gaza. On paper, it sounds like everyone wins. But we know it's not that easy with this conflict.
Yeah, exactly. And then the U.S. comes in with a whole new proposal, kind of throws a wrench in the works. Instead of tying the hostage release to all those bigger political goals, they want half the hostages freed right away, and the rest. They only get released after a permanent ceasefire is in place.
So basically, the U.S. is saying free the hostages first, and then we'll talk about everything else. But doesn't that mean Hamas loses its leverage? I mean, what do they have to bargain with if the hostages are already gone?
That's the problem, right? Hamas sees those hostages as their main card in these negotiations.
Right.
They're not going to give that up easily, especially with Trump putting on the pressure and the U.S. seemingly changing its position.
And then there's the situation in Gaza itself. Israel is using that blockade, no food, no fuel, no medicine, nothing getting in, and there are 2 million people living there.
It's a really worrying situation from a humanitarian perspective. Gaza is already devastated from the war, and if they cut off essential supplies, it's just going to make things so much worse for the people there. It could turn into a full-blown crisis.
It's like a game of chicken, almost. Israel thinks Hamas will cave under the pressure, with the blockade and the public outcry, but what if they don't? What if Hamas calls their bluff?
That's the worst-case scenario. If Hamas doesn't back down and Israel keeps up that blockade, things could get really bad, really fast. We could be right back at war with even more suffering.
It doesn't bear thinking about, and it makes those talks between the U.S. and Hamas seem even more important, right? The U.S. is in a position to influence both sides, but how do they balance their support for Israel with, finding a solution that actually works for everyone, including the Palestinians?
It's a tough line to walk. The U.S. has always been there for Israel with diplomacy, with military support, but now they're talking to Hamas, opening this new channel.
Yeah.
Maybe it can help calm things down, but it also risks damaging that relationship with Israel.
I keep thinking about how this all looks, to the rest of the world. The U.S. has called Hamas terrorists for years, and now they're negotiating. Can anyone really see them as an honest broker now?
It's a good point. The U.S. has to be careful not to alienate either side. They need to show they're serious about finding a solution that works for both Israel and Hamas, while also making sure the people in Gaza aren't forgotten. It's a tall order, maybe even impossible.
And then you've got Egypt with this massive plan to rebuild Gaza, $53 billion. They're talking about rebuilding everything, boosting the economy, even fixing social problems. It's a huge vision, but can it actually work?
It really depends on a few things. First, you need peace. You can't rebuild if there's a constant threat of war.
Yeah.
Second, there has to be trust. Can Israel trust Hamas to use the money right? And will Hamas accept a plan that basically comes from their rivals?
Plus, there's the money itself, $53 billion. Are the Arab nations really going to pay up, especially when a lot of them have their own economic issues?
We'll have to see. If they're serious about peace in the region, they need to show it, and that means putting up the money. But even if they do, actually getting this done in a place like Gaza, with all the political stuff and the security risks, it's going to be incredibly hard.
It almost feels like Egypt is trying to make everyone happy. Rebuilding Gaza helps with the humanitarian crisis, and it gives Hamas a reason to keep the peace. And for Israel, a stable Gaza is probably better for them in the long run.
Exactly. But it all comes back to trust. Or, well, the lack of it. If they want this reconstruction to work, if they want to fix the hostage crisis, everyone needs to let go of some of that suspicion and work together.
So we've got these tense negotiations, a humanitarian crisis that could explode at any minute, and a giant reconstruction plan that could either be a game changer or a total flop. A lot to think about.
The main takeaway here is that things are changing constantly. We're at this point where anything could happen. It's hard to say what's going to happen next, but the next few weeks are going to be crucial for the hostages, for Gaza, for the whole region.
It's like we're all holding our breath, waiting to see what happens.
That's a good way to put it. There's this feeling of tension, uncertainty, hanging over everything. And in the middle of it all are those hostages and their families stuck in this terrible waiting game.
We'll take another quick break to consider everything. When we come back, we'll try to figure out what the future holds for the hostages and the people of Gaza. Don't go anywhere. Okay, we're back. And man, there's a lot to unpack here. We've got negotiations, ultimatums, a humanitarian crisis brewing. Feels like one move in this hostage situation just sets off a whole chain of events.
Yeah, it's like a big, complicated chess game. Everyone's trying to guess what the other side will do next, and then there are all these unexpected things happening too.
And honestly, there's just so much distrust between all these groups. It makes you wonder if any of these plans, the ceasefires, Egypt's rebuilding idea, if any of it can really work when everyone's so suspicious of each other.
That's the core issue here, isn't it? The lack of trust. It's like they're trying to build a house on sand. Even the best plan won't stand if there's no foundation.
So then, how do you even start to build trust in a situation like this? After so much violence and anger, it seems impossible.
It's a huge challenge for sure. But I think, maybe, it starts with trying to understand where the other side is coming from. You don't have to agree with what they're doing, but you have to at least see their point of view.
That's tough, though, right? Especially when you're talking about groups with such different beliefs and goals.
Of course. But if they don't at least try to bridge that gap, any solution is just going to be a Band-Aid. It won't last.
Okay, let's talk about these U.S.-Hamas talks. It was such a bold move by the U.S., but is it really changing anything? Is Israel less likely to go for a full-scale invasion now?
Hard to say for sure. But I think it's having some effect. Remember, Israel was getting ready for a ground invasion. They were talking tough. But with the U.S. talking to Hamas, well, it makes things more complicated for them.
Right, like the U.S. threw a wrench into their plans, even if they didn't mean to. Israel can't just attack Gaza without thinking about what the U.S. will do, especially since their biggest ally is now talking to their enemy.
That's it. The U.S., whether they meant to or not, changed the whole dynamic, in making everyone stop and think before they do anything.
Do you think this means the U.S. is trying to hold Israel back? I mean, they've always supported Israel no matter what.
It's subtle, but yeah, maybe. The U.S. is walking a very fine line here. They want to keep that strong relationship with Israel, but they also know they need a different approach to this conflict.
Yeah.
It's tricky, and who knows if it'll work.
So what do you think is the most likely outcome of all this? We've got different ceasefire plans. Egypt wants to rebuild Gaza. The U.S. is talking to Hamas. It's a lot. Where do you think this is all going?
It's really hard to say. This is all new territory. I do think these next few weeks are going to be crucial. Either we see some progress, maybe some hostages get released, maybe they agree on a ceasefire, or things could get a lot worse, especially if no one starts trusting each other.
It feels like we're just waiting, holding our breath to see what happens.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. There's this tension, this uncertainty everywhere you look.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, in the middle of it all are those hostages and their families, just waiting, not knowing what's going to happen to them.
Well, I think we've really dug into this complex situation today. We've talked about the different sides, what they want, the political games, the humanitarian crisis, and what could happen next. It's heavy stuff, but hopefully this deep dive has given you a better understanding of what's going on and what's at stake.
I think so. And it's important to remember that even though this feels like a big abstract conflict, real people's lives are being affected by every decision that gets made.
We'll leave you with this one last thought. Do you think lasting peace is even possible in this region? And if so, how do we get there? It's a tough question, but it's worth asking. Until next time, stay curious.